Hello, personal health and wellness. Welcome to chapter 9, and this is about managing your stress. And since we're in the beginning of the semester, I'm certain that you are dealing with some stress, and hopefully it's good stress, and hopefully things are starting to settle down for you. As we begin, I would like for you to consider some of the items in your life, or maybe people, that bring you stress. Maybe it's situations or just frankly how you deal with them that bring you the most stress. And so one of the things that we will do is we will kind of begin here within what is our stress. And you see, I've got Emmett here. And if you don't know who Emmett is, from the Lego movie, you are missing out. I need you to just understand that's a fantastic movie. So go and watch that. It will help your stress. So we're beginning in our definitions. And in our definitions, some of the things that we will see first is just a simple definition of what stress is. And again, like I said earlier, a lot of times we think this is possibly something about our life specifically, maybe even a person, and we attach a name to stress. But it is simply a disturbance that is due to a real, or check this out, a perceived threat. And so it may not even really be a threat, but it causes us stress. And I bet if you were to assess the things in your life, you would probably come up and say, yeah, that was probably not real or even something I should have been worried about. And you know what, as I get older, I've noticed that there's a lot of things that I worried about and I stressed about that now I just have to go to my good friend Rod, and he says, don't sweat the small stuff. And man, that has helped me a lot. But anyways, let's look at this next term, and that is stressor, an event where the body tries to adapt. And this is unique to our biology because we have cells that make up our entire body. And a cell basically will receive stress, and that cell will either not even acknowledge that stress because it's not anything to worry about, or that cell will adapt to the stress, and it will have to adapt because the stress is so great. Or the third thing is if the stress is so great and the cell can adapt and it doesn't think that it can handle it, it just dies. And so stressors are very real. And so we have to consider that, how that affects our biology. Now, there's a couple of different types of stress. Number one is eustress. This is a positive response that assists with personal growth. And I'd like for you to think about this in situations in your life where things kind of feel stressful. You get those same kind of stressful responses, and we're going to see those here in just a minute. But they're really not a bad thing. They're a good thing, and we find that they're very enjoyable. Maybe this is like in a competition, or possibly when you're going out on a date or something like that. There's some stress, but it's related to something very positive. And then there's this distress, and this is what we commonly believe that stress is in our lives, and that is a negative response. But again, it's perceived as a negative thing, and it can diminish our wellness. And so we are making a choice to perceive it as negative. And I'm going to let another colleague really explain and go into that with our supplemental video that is down below this video, and she's going to do a much better job. But I really think that when you see that, what you're going to understand is our perception of this stress really matters. Next on my list is the stress response, and that is over on page 324. And as you look at page 324, you see a young lady there, and she kind of looks more like she's grossed out than she's stressed out. But if you look at her and you look at the list that is over on the right, what you see is the hearing ability increases, more blood flows to the brain, the pupils dilate. And what they're talking about here is what happens when you become stressed. And if you will take a look at our slide here, and you see that we have the parasympathetic and sympathetic responses. And parasympathetic is basically where we're at all the time. We're kind of chilling and hanging out in our homeostasis. And homeostasis is over on page 325. And that's our physiological equilibrium, where all of our internal conditions are kind of just at chill. And that's a very good place to be. but sometimes things happen and our sympathetic nervous system takes over. And when it does, that's where you see these things on the list. The hearing ability increases, the more blood flowing to the brain, the pupils dilate to bring in more light, and so you can see more things. Also, it says that your respiration and your heart rate and blood pressure all increase. So you're seeing this big readiness occur in our body for possibly something that we're going to have to deal with in a physical way. And when I say physical, I don't just mean like just by those responses. I mean literally we may have to fight. And that's some of the way our body responds to a stressful event. This is all controlled through the third bullet there, the autonomic nervous system and your hypothalamus. And so we see a threat or we perceive a threat. Remember, perceiving is a possible way of dealing with a negative issue, but we perceive it and we do one of three things. Just like those cells, we adapt or we fight it, we run away from it, or we die. And so this is the fight or flight response, but I always throw in that third and very morbid thing of dying because that happens as well. Now, if you look at page 324 and you see this young lady, you're going to see a lot of other things occurring too. But that is our stress response, and I'd like for you to be very familiar with what it is that the body does, as that is some of the things that you'll see on the quiz and the test. Now, what kind of harm can stress cause? Well, there's a lot of things that can happen, and your book gives us 4 specific systems where stress causes harm. First of all, cardiovascular disease. Later, we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease in the very next chapter, and we're going to tell you, just like we did in chapter 1, it's the highest overall killer of Americans. And if you understand that that is a very real thing, what you're going to also understand is that stress can cause harm to our cardiovascular system in a couple of different ways. One, it makes more plaque stick in the insides of our vessels, and we're going to look at that in the next chapter. But it also causes this thing called vasoconstriction, and you're going to see that in the supplemental video here today. But one thing that you need to understand is that that means that less blood can go through that very constricted blood vessel, and that makes it very hard to handle on all of the places that need blood. And that's just kind of a simple way of looking at it. But the thing that we know is that if this becomes chronic or it's all the time, then what we know is that that causes a hardening of these arteries to happen more quicker. And that is the atherosclerosis, which we'll look at in chapter 10. But then you look down at number 2 and you see this immune system deficiency. And what we know is that stress, when we experience it, can limit or kill our immunity cells. And we need those immunity cells to keep us from getting sick. And you've probably heard that if a person stays stressed for a very long time, they can become sick. Well, it's a true physiological event. And so that's one of the other things that we need to think about in stress causing harm. Number 3, other physical effects. We can have weight problems. We can have hair and skin problems. We can even see diabetes affected by stress and the way we have to deal with diabetes. Our digestive systems sometimes become upset because we deal with stress, and this is something that many of you have dealt with before. You get stressed and you have maybe heartburn or indigestion, and you have to take a Tums or something like that. And then the final physical effect that we may see here is a loss of libido, and we're going to talk all about libido and sexual health in the second module. But one of the things that I will come back to is that we want to have a good sexual health, and to do that, one of the things we need to do is make sure that we keep our stress in check. And we're going to talk about that at the end of this chapter. Number 4, stress and the mind. Listen, we can aggravate or we can cause an onset of a mental disorder. The A&D is anxiety and depression, something that I hold very close and have experienced a lot in my life. And when I know that I'm going into a stressful situation, I have to prepare for that. And again, we're going to talk about ways to offset stress, and I want you to understand that these 4 things right here are very common and very affected by stress. Next is the major sources of stress, and we could probably predict most of these without a list, right? If you have to go through a change or you make a change in plans, this is number one on my list. I do not take change well. I don't know, you may, but I just simply don't adapt well. It doesn't work for my personality. I'm a planner. I like to know that what's going to happen is going to happen. And if it doesn't, then it's frustrating. And that can be just from very little changes, like you're walking up the wrong aisle in church and you got to turn because your seat was taken. It stresses me out, man. And I just can't always handle that. Number two is performance. And many of you do understand this because you yourself have had performance-based issues where you're kind of like, hey, I'd really, really, really like to do well on this test. And maybe that works. Inconsistent goals and behaviors are a third part. And one thing that you want to consider is if you look at your goals and they are not SMART goals, then that is the first problem that you have with inconsistency. You need to make sure that you keep your goals in that acronym, make sure they're specific, measurable, action oriented, realistic, and time oriented. And that's where we can maintain a consistent goal. But our behaviors are also something that can be very inconsistent. We can treat one situation and another very differently. Overload and burnout, we've all experienced. And I will tell you that as an adult, you will only experience this more because you will commit yourself to so many things that it won't take long before you are feeling the stress. And it's kind of simple math, really. If you have too much going on and you're stressed about it, you can simply take things away and reduce your stress. But that doesn't work for a lot of people. The environmental sources of stress, hassles, relationships obviously have caused you stress. What about cultural isolation? Have you ever experienced that where you're not a regular part of the culture in the context of where you're at, and so you maybe feel isolated because you're not one of those people that you're hanging around with? You don't do the same things, you don't act the same ways, you just don't follow the same patterns of or beliefs or values, and so that may change the way you feel about your situation. And then ultimately, conflict. Our last slide today is about management strategies, and this is where I want to spend a little extra time. First of all, we look at the internal resources, and these are the things that you can do to deal with stress. And many, many times, and you're going to see this in the next video, we can change the way stress affects our body simply by the way we view stress. And this is your psychological hardiness. And what I'm looking at here is simply to say, do you have kind of a stronger outlook on how you can deal with stress? On page 331, it says psychological hardy people are characterized by control, commitment, and willingness to embrace a challenge. And what we can do is we can look at stress and we can let it absorb us, or we can understand that that is our body's way of rising to a challenge. Exercise, fun, and recreation. Listen, exercise is stress. It releases very similar hormones that you would release if you were going through a stressful situation with a change or a relationship or a conflict. But what we know is that stress hormone release has to happen because we get an abundance of a reversal in those as we get better at exercise. And so I'm going to push, again, the textbook is named Get Fit, Stay Well. We're going to push for that exercise to happen. Basic wellness measures are to eat well, sleep a lot, not too much though. Listen, we have to keep that in check. Remember, control, avoid alcohol and tobacco. What we're talking about on the sleep part though is that you don't undersleep. And this happens so many times with us as adults. It even happens with students. And so you know what you feel like when you don't get enough sleep. What we're asking you to do is get your sleep, get what you need. And that's kind of a slippery slope because some of you may tell me you need 14 hours a night, and well, I'm just not going to believe you. Behavior modifications are assess, change, prepare, and downshift. Assess what your stressor is, change your approach to dealing with it, prepare for stressful situations when you know they're going to happen, and downshift when you can. That just simply means, listen, you don't always have to take on the responsibility that you are, and if it's too much, then you need to back out. Downshifting is a wonderful strategy for the next part, financial and time management. Again, Can you downshift? Absolutely. If you have financial issues that are causing you stress, typically that's going to center around that word debt, not around the word savings. People don't stress about their savings unless they don't have savings. People stress about debt all the time because if you have debt, you're definitely going to stress about it. One of the ways you can downshift away from debt is simply not to put yourself into debt. That means you don't take the loan, you don't buy the new car. Unless you can pay cash for it, you just avoid it altogether. And that's a wonderful way to approach your financial wellness. Your time management is the same thing. If you don't have time, then you don't have time. And that's not something you can get more of because there's only so much of it in a day. Now, again, it's a debt situation. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you are crunched on time. How do you take care of that? You downshift. You find a position in your life that may be a little less attractive to the people who, are your peers that you are trying to keep up with. And you've probably heard this term before, keeping up with the Joneses. But I want to tell you something. The Joneses are broke and they're out of time. So if that's true, then you don't have to keep up with that anymore. A thought and emotion management is what are we doing with our negative thoughts? And I am the king of negative thoughts. So trust me when I say I understand this. Also anger, and then there's A&D again, anxiety and depression. We may want to visit that internal resource of cognitive restructuring again, looking at ways to deal with those thoughts. You will probably not do this on your own. And that's why you need the next step, which is social support. You need a community of people who are ready to share and say, you know what, me too. And when you find that community that says, me too, I have negative thoughts, I have anger, I have anxiety, I have depression, those are the people you want to surround yourself with, and you want to work together, and you want to win battles together, and that's a great way to approach this. Our next is relaxation techniques. There are breathing techniques, yoga, that work fantastic. And if they work for you, then please do them and make them a part of your day, especially around stressful times, before they happen, after they happen, while they're happening. Make sure you practice this. This is something you can probably get on YouTube and find a great way to understand how to breathe for relaxation. And the final one is spiritual practice. And if you are a person like me who uses faith to deal with negative thoughts, anger, anxiety, and depression, or stress, then what you understand is that many, many times the correct prayer and meditation with the right community can help a lot. And I hope that you would try that if you haven't already. It's been a wonderful position in my life to take against stress and making a strategy against it. So that being said, I am going to send you off to the next video, and that will happen with Kelly McGonigal, and I will look for your quiz after you take that. Hope everything's going well. See you soon.